Hi, I am Natalie, and I picked this book, The Knowledge Ahead Approach to Risk, which is basically introducing new theories and ideas in economics about how we make decisions when faced with risk. I think this is really important beyond economics as well, in that economics is supposed to be, a search for understanding of human behavior, right? And it's also a search for understanding efficiency and scarcity. And I think when we improve those methods and we change the way economists view decision making and rationality, it has influence in all other spheres about what it means to be efficient or what it means to be rational. And so I think this issue goes much deeper than just, how we decide if we're going to buy insurance, which I think is shown in the way the book approaches the way that people make the decisions, which is a lot more accurate, to my experience anyway. Sorry. So the main theory being discussed here is this expected utility theory, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the prevailing economic theory about risk decision making, and basically it says that we will choose the profit maximizing choice or the utility maximizing choice based on what we expect to get out of a given decision, right? So I'm going to walk you through an example. This is the scenario the book gives that is kind of given throughout the book in reference in terms of understanding this new theory. However, I'm going to walk it through in terms of expected utility. So this is you. You are a person. You have an asset worth $100. Over the next X hours, right, T equals X, that asset could be destroyed. You can choose to protect against losing your $100 by choosing insurance. To insure yourself for the next X hours costs $15. So this is your choice set. You can choose to insure and spend $15 at time equals 0. That's the time you're making the decision. Or you can choose to not to insure and spend $0. If you choose to insure, then you're definitely going to keep your $100. There's no question about that. And you definitely spent $15. There's also no question about that. So it's a sure thing that by the time you reach T equals X, whichever time in the future that is, you will walk away with $85. That is a sure thing. There is no risk involved. On the other hand, you can choose not to insure. One of two things will happen. You will be attacked. That's represented by this P of attack, or probability of an attack, right here. So there's a certain percentage likelihood that you will be attacked and you will walk away with absolutely nothing. The complement of that percentage, so 1 minus this percentage, is that you will not be attacked. This is probably the more likely thing, the higher percentage in most situations, and you get to keep your $100. $100 is more than 85, but 0 is less than 85. So you are in a pickle. How are you going to decide what to do? What is the profit maximizing choice? So, given the same scenario, expected utility theory says that you would determine your expected outcomes by using this probability and multiplying it by this expected utility, or this expected value. So, to walk through, we already kind of went through how there's no risk here, so the expected utility of this choice is $85. There's no question about that. However, here it's a little bit variable. So let's put a percentage here. So let's say the probability that you will be attacked and lose your $100 is 5%. There's a 5% chance you will be attacked. So there's a 5% chance you walk away with $0. Expected utility theory says that you would multiply these two numbers together. Anytime anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So this half of the equation is kind of ready to be ignored. However, it still stays there. It's still relevant. And then you would also calculate the expected utility out of this side. So the the complement of that 5% is 95%. You have a 95% chance of walking away with $100. Expected utility theory says you multiply these two numbers, you get 95. You add that 95 to 0, and your expected utility from this outcome is $95. This is how you make a decision in the face of risk. Because it's so unlikely you will be attacked, this expected utility is higher than this expected utility. Expected utility theory says you will choose not to insure, and the only situation in which you would choose to insure is when this option gives you more utility than this option. For that to happen, the likelihood of you not being attacked would have to be 0.85 or less, meaning the likelihood of attack would have to be 15% or higher for you to consider buying insurance. Notice that neither outcome actually gets you $95. This is not a real number. In no case will you walk away with exactly $95. You'll either walk away with $100 or no money. However, this is what you expect to get out of choosing this, so that's why that's where that number comes from. Now, some additional features of the EUT are the dominance principle, which I kind of just talked about, and it's basically EUT, or expected utility theory, is first order stochastic dominance principle, meaning that you will always choose, like I said, the higher or the better or the more beneficial option, similar to rational choice theory, and that you will always choose a Pareto improvement, meaning that if something is, like in this situation, something is always better and never worse, you'll choose this. If this is most likely better, you'll choose this. Another element of this expected utility theory is this idea of being a risk-averse, risk-loving, or risk-neutral. So this is an idea kind of expanding on how people can be different, right? So some people are risk-loving, they may be gamblers, and they get a lot of satisfaction out of taking a risk. And others might be risk-averse, and they do not like taking risk, and they would rather take a sure bet that earned them less money than take a risk that might earn them more money and probably was more likely to earn them more money. So the explanation that EUT gives for these kinds of people is the diminishing marginal utility of wealth, which basically means that an increase in money means different things to different people depending on how much money they already have, right? So here we see the quantity of money is increasing by 10. However, this is utility, right, which is how much satisfaction the person gained. Even though someone is only gaining $10, their satisfaction went from 3 to 8, so it increased by 5 units. It's a pretty big increase for $10, but when you consider that it doubled their money from 10 to 20, that's twice as much. So that's a big increase, right? However, the jump from 70 to 80, even though it's still $10, only increased utility by 1, meaning that 10 extra dollars when you already have $70 is not nearly as big of a deal. And that is the explanation that EUT gives for why some people are more risk-loving or more risk-averse. Now, I'm going to get into the problems here, but just as far as I've gone, I'd like to ask, how does this line up with how you make decisions? Not just necessarily decisions about risk, but decisions in general. Decisions about purchasing or decisions about, life. Does this sound familiar to you? So here's what the researchers found wrong with EUT. First of all, it found that previous research was very context vague, was very abstract, and in attempts to kind of make very broad generalizations about how we make decisions, the researchers would ignore context and stick to very simple, very easy to explain scenarios. By only using these scenarios and by not giving a lot of details about context, researchers ended up missing out on a lot of different things that context can add to make a situation different. So some examples of this lack of context and framing and how research has shown that it matters, right? Some examples of that is, 1, people make more conservative choices when the decision impacts others. That kind of sounds like common sense. I'm probably going to be more careful driving when someone else is in the car with me rather than if it's just me by myself. The second example is that risk can change in groups, but whether or not the decision was made democratically. These researchers actually talked to some mountaineers or people who go hiking and found that they decided different levels of danger in terms of what hike they were going to take based on how the decision was made. And then 3, research has found that people tend to be more conservative based on what kind of risk. So they're more conservative when talking about terrorism than they are when talking about other risks, even if the probabilities were similar. So even if there's a similar likelihood something will happen, people are more conservative in the face of terrorism versus other risks. Some additional problems is that there's a one-dimensional measure of satisfaction. So the thing about utility is that, I may have mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily have to be money. You can gain satisfaction from something that has absolutely nothing to do with the monetary value. However, no matter what those satisfactions are, they all have to be collapsible, or they have to be combined into one single value or one single number, even if they're contradictory, right? And the idea is there's a very complex equations going on in your head about what you value more, and how much utility you gain from certain things. There's also no element of time, and there's no consideration for changes of knowledge. So what makes a risk is that you don't know what's going to happen. That's what makes it a risk. If you knew it was going to happen, it would just be a normal choice between two sure things. But this is a risk where there's probability involved, there's chance involved, and what you know about that probability and those chances can change. And what you know about what you have can change. And EUT doesn't really consider that. It really only considers the bottom line. So this is how the researchers thought they could improve upon expected utility theory. So the researchers identified 2 different sources of utility, or they termed it satisfaction. Other research in the past has kind of hinted at these things. It sort of gets touched on with the notion of risk aversion or risk loving, but I think this paints a fuller picture, and I think this creates a framework to organize any potential emotion or value, as opposed to only selecting a couple specific emotions or satisfactions to include. This is just a matter of sorting all the multitudinous satisfactions that people get from things into different categories. So the first category is a primary satisfaction, and that's the utility we've already talked about. It's basically the utility covered by expected utility, and that is the satisfaction from the outcome of decision. In the previous example, this primary satisfaction would be either the $100 or the $0 or the $85, right? It's the satisfaction or the thing that you get at the end. It happens independently of time, independently of risk, independently of the process of making a decision. And then there's secondary satisfactions, and that's the things that satisfy you based on the process of decision making. So some examples include the excitement from gambling, or maybe the blame for a negative outcome, right? These satisfactions can be positive or negative, but one comes from just the bottom line and has nothing to do with risk, only to do with your takeaway. And the secondary satisfaction, which is no less important than the primary, but it comes from the process of decision making. It comes from the risks and the process of getting different levels of knowledge at different times. So this is the time element that the researchers introduced, and I think it's really wonderful. So I'm going to walk you through it. Period 1, right? This is the first step in making a decision, and that is the pre-choice set. So one thing that we're kind of ignoring sometimes, and this is relevant at least for me in my life, is that we don't always know what our options are. Oftentimes we have to spend time identifying the choice set or figuring out what we have to choose from. So for example, I had to buy a couch this year with my boyfriend. And I was planning on looking on Kirksville Swap Shop for some cheap used couches. The thing about using those buy and sell apps and such is that you never know when someone's going to add something new. So when I was determining whether or not I should buy a couch, right, once I had been through all the options that were currently available and I knew none of them worked, either the seller would not be back in town until August and I moved in May, or the couch was too big or too dirty. So I had to wait for the choice set to be identified. And in that case, I knew that the choice set was never going to be identified. I wouldn't know, and there's no point of time when I would fully know what the choice set was, because the choice set was always changing. What's available is always changing. So that was the biggest thing I thought about when I read this part, is how I bought a couch and how I could relate to this decision-making process, right? So the start of this period is before the choice set is identified, and the end of this period is when contract and the risk without it have been identified. So this also makes a great case for bartering and negotiation if you're in a business setting. The choice set in that case also hasn't been identified, right? Someone may have given you an offer, but you might have a counteroffer, and so you don't know if that's a choice you can make. And so once the negotiations are done, or once the contract has been drawn up, and once you know all your other options, right? Maybe you might have options for a contract with a different person. Maybe, you know, one thing the book talked about was if you are hiring someone for a job, you might be choosing between two applicants, or you might be waiting for more applications to come in. So the end of this period 1 is when you know what all of your available options are. This is denoted by delta K1, or change 1 in knowledge. This is your change in knowledge. So period 2 is called the pre-choice period. And that's the time in which you know what the choices are and you're going to choose one of them. So this is really the part where a lot of the expected utility stuff and the satisfactions come into play. This period starts when the full choice set is identified, right at the end of the last period, and it ends when a decision is made. Now, what I think is important about this period is that this period can determine a lot of secondary satisfactions. For example, if you're given 5 seconds to make a decision, you might experience a lot less guilt, and you're a lot less worried about what people are thinking about your decision, because you say, hey, you know, it was a very short amount of time. If any of you have seen that Tom Hanks movie where he crashes the plane, that's kind of the argument he makes, is when they do the simulations and they say, you know, you made the wrong decision to do that water landing. He was like, well, I had 30 seconds to make that decision. So this pre-choice period, I think, is very important to think of as a time frame, right? And another big issue that the researchers gave with the expected utility theory is that there's no account whatsoever for any of the duration of these time frames. So the how long this period lasts is also very relevant. And this is described by change in knowledge, or delta K2. Period 3 is the pre-outcome period, right? So you've made your decision, and now all there's left to do is wait. This is the point where some of those secondary satisfactions might come in and might set in. Another thing to notice is that there's also a loss in like reliability. So one example that the book gave is that when you are in this period, right, let's say that you choose to, when you're back in the insurance scenario, and you choose to pay for insurance, or you choose not to insure. So you don't know if you have that $100 to spend, or if it's going to be stolen. So all the time spent between when you make the decision to not insure and when you know for a fact whether or not the asset is retained, or whether or not you kept the $100, that whole time you can't spend that $100. Even if you end up keeping the $100, you must live your life assuming that you don't have that $100 because of the unknown, all right? The change in knowledge. So the duration of this period of time could be a big factor in your ability to make a decision, right? So again, this period starts when you've made a choice, so there's nothing you can do about your choice after this period starts, and it only ends when you know what happens, right? And that's the change in knowledge number 3. And then we have the last period, which is the post-outcome period. And this is where you get all those primary satisfactions. This is where you get to walk away with the $100 or $85 or $0. It starts when the outcome of a choice or event is known, and it basically never ends until you are done, I guess, reaping the satisfactions or the negative aspects of a certain decision. So altogether, this is what the stages of knowledge ahead looks like. You've got your pre-choice set, right? You're figuring out, you're negotiating, you're making a contract, you're looking for all your options available, and then you know what you have to choose from. That's the choice set is identified. Then you have the pre-choice period, the time you have to deliberate and make a decision. That all culminates into the point where the decision made, considered time equals 0. You've made a decision, and then you have to wait in the pre-outcome period, and you wait to see if you made a good decision or if you made a bad decision. And then the outcome happens, right? Either you gain a reward or you lose something, or maybe neither. If you'll notice for the insurance example, this stage doesn't exist. And then you have your post-outcome period. That's when you reap all your primary satisfactions from the outcome. These are the different stages in knowledge, and these are the times in which they occur. The choice set being a negative time because we define the time equals 0 as the time when the decision is made, and time equals X is when the outcome is known, because this is an indeterminate amount of time. You'll notice again for the in the situation where no insurance was chosen, we jump right from this decision made process to outcome known process, right? Because we do not have to worry about whether there's an attack. We know the outcome, and we know the outcome will be $85. So there are many situations, or like in my couch situation, this pre-choice set period is kind of lasting the whole time, right? And I have to make a decision before the choice set is identified, because the choice set is almost never identified. So those are the ways in which stages of knowledge ahead theory, it's called SCAT for the theory part, describes how we make decisions. So that is basically all I had for describing the book. The whole second half of the book goes on to talk about research that has kind of supported these theories, and I think there's one really important piece to show you all that kind of proves that expected utility is not really doing what it needs to do, and that it could benefit from this sort of analysis, right? So earlier we talked about risk-loving and risk-averse, and typically what those curves look like are either concave, convex, or a straight line, correct? So they make this shape, or this shape, sorry, or a straight line. However, when the researchers did research where they combined both qualitative and quantitative data on how people make decisions given using the exact same scenario, and they gave different numbers of probabilities for the likelihood of an attack. They noticed some differences both in the order that they listed the probabilities, meaning that if they started from the highest probability of an attack to the lowest probability of an attack, that yielded different results than the other way around. But the biggest thing they noticed is when they aggregated the data, or even when they mapped it out for individual participants, they got utility functions. This is their utility curves that looked like S's. That doesn't follow any of the EUT patterns used and described in my economics classes. And they have several more of these where almost all of them follow sort of this S curve, right? Where they curve upward like this and then take turns. They take more than one turn. There's a couple more. So here's a couple more examples of kind of the same thing where they switch from convex to concave to convex, and oftentimes there are straight lines, right? And this straight line is to denote, you know, risk neutral, meaning this straight line is supposed to be the average person according to expected utility theory. So to see all these mapped out in completely complex ways, to me shows, proves the researcher's right, and it helps a lot with the ethos of the argument, which I'm now going to get into kind of what I got out of this book. So I think the strongest thing about this book was the ethos, right? The trust in their knowledge, all right? Not only did they have a lot of really good logical points, but most of their points was rooted in previous research. The thing is full of references all over the place and basically has a whole bunch of appendices, citing principles, citing data, and with references of all kinds of different studies done. And they were able to be very specific. And so that really made it convincing to me that the researchers had been working with this issue for quite some time. There's not much of an emotional appeal to it, other than the fact that I was really easily able to relate the theories with my own decision-making process, right? And I've had these conversations in like sociology and whatnot with, what is our assumption of a rational thinker? And what's the problem with that assumption when people go outside those norms? So one of the big things the authors of this book talk about is how problematic it is for us to kind of see anomalies or things that don't line up with EUT and assume that the individual is irrational or is abnormal in their decision making, when really they're just weighing different things that are valuable to them. And so for me, being a person with ADHD, being someone who's kind of impulsive, and it's hard for me to take a long time to make decisions, expected utility theory I would have to make myself fit into that box by saying that I derive more utility from whatever thing pays off the most immediately, right? Whatever benefits me in the now. And you could argue that I give that thing more utility. But this is a much better approach in saying that my satisfaction from a decision and the process of making a decision is very different than my satisfaction from the actual outcome of that decision, right? So EUT would say that I just don't value certain things just because they may be hard in the present term because I'm impulsive, right? And that makes me risk loving according to EUT, but it's just, EUT didn't make sense to me, and when I tried to apply it to myself, I couldn't make sense of it, but this I can really make sense of, and that's where I think the pathos comes in. This is not a book for everybody, and I don't think it would be very easy to read for someone who's not an economics major. However, I think that this slideshow and this video gets the main points across, and really makes a good case for what the researchers are trying to say about the way we think of rationality, the way we think of decision making, and the way we think about choice.